Welcome, everyone. Greetings to you all. It's a really special moment for us to meet tonight. We are going to have a very special guest in our Francisco and Friends webinar series. My name is Gabor Karsai, Managing Director of Mind and Life Europe. And our special guest is Professor Dr. Wolf Singer, great friend of Francisco, who will offer a talk entitled, "Why Would a Neurobiologist Become Interested in Buddhist Philosophy?" As you all know, in the context of our celebratory year this year, Francisco Varela's friends, colleagues, and dialogue partners share their personal experiences and insights about working with him and the influence of these special relationships on their life and work. Professor Dr. Wolf Singer studied medicine in Munich and Paris, obtained his MD from the Ludwig Maximilian University in Munich, and his PhD from the Technical University in Munich. He is Director Emeritus at the Max Planck Institute for Brain Research in Frankfurt and founding director both of the Frankfurt Institute for Advanced Studies and of the Ernst Strungmann Institute for Neuroscience in cooperation with the Max Planck Society. His research focuses on the neuronal substrate of higher cognitive functions, in particular on the question of how the distributed subprocesses in the brain are coordinated and bound together in order to give rise to coherent perception and action. It's a real privilege for us to have you, Wolf, here with us today. I would also like to introduce our conversational partner tonight, Amy Cohen-Varela, Chair of Mind and Life Europe Board. It's going to be a special moment for us to have you, Amy, as a conversational partner to Wolf tonight. And I'm handing over the floor to you now, Amy.
Thank you very much, Gabor. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Good. Well, it's wonderful to be a conversation partner with both Singer, who's an old friend and certainly an old friend of Mind and Life and Mind and Life Europe as well. So we are going to, I think, I'd like to start the conversation by going back a little in time to hear about your relationship with Francisco, which dates back, I think, to 1984, and hear a little bit about how the story of your friendship and colleagueship as two neuroscientists unfolded. So before we move on to other things that interest you to talk about, I thought we could sort of take a sentimental journey.
Oh, yeah. A sentimental journey. Francisco is worth it. Yeah. That was for Francisco.
What neuroscientists do when they're in confinement.
Yeah, they start practicing again.
That's a wonderful thing. So tell us, Wolf, about your first meeting with Francisco, which really dates back to relatively early.
I think. Yeah, I was invited. I had just moved to Frankfurt and taken over the Max Planck Institute for Brain Research together with my colleague Heinz Wessle. And then I got this invitation to go to Chile and to attend the annual meeting of the Chilean Neuroscience Society. And they had invited a few foreigners. And this is where I met Francisco for the very first time in Punta del Trarcas, a beautiful place very close to the home of Pablo Neruda. And so we spent a week together at this conference and also subsequently in Santiago. And I really got to know him well. We had a nice scientific dispute during this meeting. I can talk about it if you like. Mm-hmm. But when we were sitting back in Santiago in one of these cafes and had a tea time hour, and this is something very European, I thought, but I found it in Chile again. And there we sat and made drawings on the paper which was on the table. And Francisco explained to me the background of his thoughts and why autopoiesis was so important and why he thought that the brain took the initiative in our perceptions and in our existence, and that we were not simply a stimulus response machine. And there I got to know Francisco very well. During the conference, it was scientific discourse, and you don't get to know the people so well in these conditions. So it was a tea time that brought us together. And he also told me about the very difficult situation in Chile for scientists at that time. It was under Pinochet. When we were there, there was actually curfew. We had to be home at 9 o'clock or so, otherwise you couldn't move again. And since I had just started in Frankfurt and there was empty space in the institute, and I had proposed just loosely to Francisco, why don't you come? And why don't we try to make experiments that focus on your ideas? We could perhaps find some traces in doing neurobiological studies of these top-down processes that nowadays have become very, very popular, where we see that it is the brain that constructs the perceptions, it is stored knowledge that influences the processing of sensory signals. And we thought at that time, why should we not try it? And so in a sense, Francisco was one of the forerunners of these now very popular concepts of predictive coding or Bayesian perception. Thinkers in the 19th century had already done this. Helmholtz was one of those who said what we perceive is mainly determined by our expectancies and by prior knowledge. And Francisco had the same constructivistic view, obviously, still a bit more radical probably than anybody else at that time, together with Maturana. And if you like, I can explain to you why I think they had to be so extreme. But I need to thematize a little bit his time in Harvard.
Mm-hmm. Well, yeah, that's an interesting point, because he was working at Harvard as a young student under behavioralists, stimulus response people, right?
Yeah. As I understood his biography, he was first studying in Santiago, and he did a little bit of medicine because he wanted to learn more about the biological substrate of behavior and cognition. He also studied philosophy. Mm-hmm. And then he was, of course, one of those. At that time, it was difficult to do science in Chile. And because he was extremely bright, he must have won a competition to get into Harvard. So he did. And he passed his thesis in record time. I think you once told me that he was the fastest PhD student ever, yeah, and has not been bypassed by then. Mm-hmm. But then he dived, of course, into this very behaviorist world. At that time, we understood the brain as a stimulus response machine. And we thought that if we just followed the sensory signals from the sensory surfaces, from the eyes into the brain, until we come out on the other end on the motor side, we would have understood how the brain works. And this was dogma. And this also determined the way in which we did our experiments. And here was Francisco, and here was also Umberto Maturana, whom I also met when I was down there. And they put the world upside down. They said, no, the brain has the initiative. The brain sculpts the world. The brain interprets what the world appears to be. And maybe there is no such thing as an objective reality out there. Maybe what we perceive is all made up by ourselves. So he was also very close to von Förster, this very radical constructivist, and the Vienna school he was familiar with. Mm-hmm. And so he came into this world of behaviorists, and that, I think, didn't please him very much. Mm-hmm. So he did his PhD as fast as possible, maybe to escape, but maybe it just happened. And then he returned to Chile, and under the conditions he was living there, he was unhappy. And then he moved to Frankfurt.
Well, one thing one thing, Wolf, that's true about both of you is that you both had scientific training, but also philosophical training. And I remember Francisco writing somewhere, I think in a kind of an autobiographical text, that the neuroscientists at Harvard kind of made fun of him and they called him the philosopher.
Yeah, he was a true philosopher, not me. I was unhappy while I studied for a while because I thought it was all too descriptive. I studied medicine and too qualitative, and so I thought something serious should happen. And so I attended 2 semesters of philosophical propaedeutics with Stegmüller. But then I discovered that this was not the way to absolute truth either, because you could take either position as a phenomenologist or as a naturalist or as a whatever, a realist, and that depending on which position you take, the world takes a different aspect. So I said, this is not what I'm going to do either. So I returned humbly to study medicine. Mm-hmm. So I'm not a philosopher, but Francisco certainly was. He had a profound.
So you said that you proposed to him, you made this wonderful proposition to go and test some of his ideas in your lab. Can you go into that a little bit more? I mean,
yeah. We even have a publication together. Mm-hmm. I'm very proud of that one. So it was obvious what we needed to do. At that time, it was already known from anatomy that there are about 10 times more nerve fibers coming from the central nervous system down to the periphery. So the cerebral cortex sends 10 times more fibers to the thalamus, where it receives its sensory information from the eyes, for example, than it gets from the sensory periphery. But it was completely unknown what these efferent fibers, this top-down information, would do. There was no clue whatsoever. But these were the projections that Francisco needed for his philosophy, for his notion. You need to have a way where you can harvest knowledge that is stored in the brain and project it outwards in order to shape sensory input. Mm-hmm. So we thought we should study the function of this. We call it corticothalamic projection. So it goes from the cerebral cortex, from the visual cortex, down to the relay centers in the brain that mediate the sensory information upwards. So we did this experiment, and I think it was cleverly designed, trying to influence the activity in the central nervous system and in the visual cortex through one eye, and check the effect that this has on the transmission of activity from the other eye. This could be done because the pathways of the 2 eyes are segregated and only meet in the cortex. So we did this experiment and we obtained results, and we saw, yes, these top-down projections, these feedback, the centrifugal, as we called it at that time, projections do modulate and shape sensory input coming from the eyes. But since at that time, even less than now, we still ignored and still ignore how the cerebral cortex really codes information, processes information. All we had were the notions that came from these experiments that followed the behaviorists' outside-in direction. So we had difficulties to interpret what we saw. We had effects, they were interesting, we had some ideas, and then we published and we got it accepted right away. And this was the fruits of about 2 years of very nice collaboration.
So in a way, this is the cerebral or neural substrate of the active brain as opposed to the passive receptor brain.
Well, now we have a complete change in paradigm. Mm-hmm. Not all of us, but the hype that we now experience in the moment with these deep learning networks that are used in artificial intelligence, they still follow one-to-one this initial behaviorist stance of a simple serial feed-forward processing of information from one layer to the next, only in one direction. They're extremely performing, but they lack many of the properties that our brains have, particularly the generative properties. And now we know that all over the place we have more projections, more information channels mediating top-down information than bottom-up. So it's a late confirmation of the suspicion that Francisco already had. And we also know that the brain is an extremely distributed, self-organizing system, also something that Francisco liked a lot. So the absence of a conductor in the brain, but understanding brain functions as emergent property of a complex system that is highly dynamic and self-organizes. We can go there again when we talk about Buddhism, perhaps. But maybe we trace Francisco's path a little bit further, because when he left Frankfurt, came back every now and then. I think a nice meeting was in 1987. Then he moved to Paris to the École Polytechnique. He did not want to go back to Chile. And then, supported by the Fondation de France, he got a stipend to work at Jussieu, I think, in the context of CREA. I don't know these French abbreviations anymore, but so he did work there. He was an experimentalist. He worked in the tectum of pigeons, so it's an optical center in pigeons. Actually, I got a PhD student of his who had started in Paris and then came to us because we had better technical infrastructure, Sergio Neuenschwander.
Right.
You must know him, a very sweet man, and he stood with us for 10 or 12 years, very long. Now he's directing an institute in Natal in Brazil. So there's a Latin American connection there. And then Francisco finally became Directeur de Recherche, Grade 1, so quite the highest you can reach, at CNRS, at the Centre National de Recherche Scientifique, and his own lab in the Clinique Salpêtrière.
Right.
And I remember he was sitting it was underground, so one had to step down. But already at that time, and that was quite pioneering early, he got a magnetoencephalogram. Right. In order to register with relatively high spatial resolution activity in the human brain. And this was a very fruitful time for him, because now he had the opportunity to test some of his more overarching hypotheses on consciousness. And I think the people at that time, there was Serge Lachaud, Antoine Lutz, who is still around with Mind and Life, was there. Who else was there? Woodruff. Then Diego Cosmelli was there. Many of them have Palacios was there. And many of them have stood in science. So they are Francisco's legacy in neuroscience. They came out of this lab in Salpêtrière. And this was the time where he worried much about the emergence of the psyche from material processes. So the conundrum of consciousness. How come that a material substrate can produce something immaterial, qualia of consciousness?
Or does it?
Huh?
Does it?
Yeah, I think Francisco thought it does. I would certainly say it does. There is no such thing as a consciousness that is independent of our active brains, but this we can discuss. And he wrote a seminal paper, The Brain Shadow, I think was the title, that was published in Nature and was very, very well received, where he provided evidence that conscious perception differs from subconscious processing of stimuli, which we of course also do all the time, mainly because in the case of a conscious processing, large areas of the cortical mental get tied into a coherent pattern of activity. And I think he was damn right. with this hypothesis. And this also created links between us, because we had in Frankfurt at that time worked a lot about synchrony and brain oscillations and stuff like this. Mm-hmm. And he had pursued this in the human brain in the context of exploring the neuronal substrate of consciousness. The mystery being this unity of consciousness. When something appears in consciousness, everything that is in consciousness is related to each other. It's bound together. That's what's called the unity of consciousness. Something that also already Sherrington, nearly 100 years by now, mm-hmm. before had worried about. And he had this intuition, which was seminal at that time, that the unity of consciousness is not existing because consciousness is at a particular place in the brain, at a particular, restricted to a particular area, but that it is a dynamic state. And he phrased it in saying the unity of consciousness is not a question of the unity in space, but it is a unity in time. And that was pointing towards a dynamic interpretation of conscious states that had later been taken up again by Bars, who coined this term of the workspace of consciousness, in which everything that is conscious is bound together and vibrating in unison. Mm-hmm. Later taken up by Stanislas Dehaene and Jean-Pierre Changeux, trying to define this workspace of consciousness as part of the cortical structures.
Mm-hmm. That's more of a space theory, right? That's as opposed to thinking about consciousness in terms of dynamical systems and time dimension.
Localizing is, of course, trying to localize it to the cerebral cortex. We know that if the cerebral cortex cannot work properly because of particular sleep phases or because of anesthesia or coma, then this is incompatible with the conscious state. This is what is well established. But the question was, is there a single place in the cortical mantle, maybe in the phylogenetically very recent prefrontal cortex, that has to be activated in order for contents to become conscious? Mm-hmm. There has been very little evidence for this so far. Therefore, people were thinking more, consciousness must be a particular state of a distributed system. And the workspace hypothesis says, there are certain layers of the 6-layered cerebral cortex that are so intimately coupled reciprocally that this is maybe the substrate for a dynamic state that could be considered as the correlate of consciousness. So, but this question is still open for dispute. There are still experiments performed to confirm or falsify these ideas. So it's an interesting debate. What we still, just by doing neurobiology, cannot approach, and I guess this was also Francisco's idea, is how we come to assign to ourselves this spiritual, immaterial, mental dimension, how that can emerge from our material constitution, and how
this reminds me a little bit, Wolf, of what you were saying when we had a discussion about Francisco, that he was interested, you said he was interested in what's in between.
Oh yeah, the in between.
And this idea that consciousness is an emergent property, and that consciousness is not something that takes place even within a brain, but takes place in a brain that's in a body, that's in a world, the inactive proposition for embodied mind, again calls on this notion of the entre-deux, which is actually a phenomenological notion, but you mentioned that. So
because I had an experience with Francisco concerning this in between. I very much share these ideas that the essential is in between. If you have two neurons, they do something. The important aspect of these two nodes is the relation between them. So it's relational constructs that are so fascinating. And Francisco once told me, the essence is in the in-between. And he used a strange example. He said, yeah, a muscle, when it contracts, it gets thicker. What matters is not the muscle itself, it is the space the muscle occupies. And when it contracts, the space is deformed. And I had difficulties to follow this. We had a lot of scientific disputes because being a radical constructivist and adherent to autopoiesis, you would of course say all the world is made up by your constructions. But when I met Francisco, actually, I was still a hard-nosed developmental neurobiologist, and I learned from doing experiments how strongly the architecture of a mature brain is shaped during development by the experience of the world around us. Actually, it's a sine qua non. Without this experience, no cognition would be possible. So I always told Francisco, yeah, okay, the a priori knowledge in the brain is shaping sensory signals and making up for experience. Mm-hmm. But the architecture that does this, the knowledge that is used in order to do that, is already derived from the outer world because it was used to shape the nervous system. So the internal model of the world is not there a priori, but is acquired during development. Mm-hmm. So I saw it more as a ping pong between the two, while Francisco, at times at least, was much more radical, opposing probably the hard-nosed Harvard tradition. I think it was also a little bit polemic. He had to go far out with the pendulum swing in order to make himself and these ideas heard.
Mm-hmm. At the same time, he was a rigorous experimentalist.
Yes. Yeah. He was good. He was great in the lab. He liked that. And I think he's an empiricist. He's not somebody who makes up his ideas without empirical grounding.
Right.
No, he was a biologist.
Right.
Yeah. A naturalist, I would say, which did not prevent him from being very spiritual. And this is the interesting aspect. And this is again where we come to this in between, or let me better call it the relation, the relations. As I just alluded a little bit to, I don't think that the mystery of our dichotomy being both a material being and also participating in a non-immaterial world where social realities dominate, where the intangible is important, where belief systems dominate our behavior, and where also we assign to ourselves this spiritual dimension, and which has given rise to ontological dualism, which a neurobiologist, of course, has difficulties to find. So I think where we harmonize very well, and it would be lovely if we could still debate this with Francisco, because we all developed over the decades, is that it is probably not possible to derive these immaterial connotations of our being, like consciousness, like feelings, like perceptions, the contents of perceptions, and also the constitution of the self, simply by looking into brains. I guess one has to expand the domain, and this is what Francisco did, and understand ourselves as beings that owe their existence a biological evolution that was all material, and we can backtrace it very well, but then started to initiate social interactions among each other, to mirror each other, to find terms for experiences that you can only have if you observe the other acting, and then creating these immaterial dimensions that owe their existence to cultural evolution. So contents of belief systems, convictions, assignments of character properties and stuff like this. And then reattribute part of these social realities to our own being. Probably this happens during education because we are embedded in this world that exists and that contains both material realities and very mighty immaterial realities, constructs that we have developed during cultural evolution. And they are extremely mighty because the content of a belief can lead you to make enormous sacrifices, to build cathedrals and things like that, which you would not do if you didn't have those immaterial constructs and metaphysical dimensions. So I think if Francisco were here, he would subscribe that we are what we are because we have these cognitive abilities that we owe biological evolution, but because also we have been embedded, we have been constructing a immaterial reality through cultural evolution and are embedded in this, and that this cannot be subdivided. So without this relation, these relational constructs between our embedding and ourselves, we wouldn't be what we are.
Right. I think the key word is I think the key word is relational. And that corresponds very, very much to Francisco's conceptualization with Maturana of autopoiesis, of the definition of what he called in the living, and even in the single-celled organism, the creation of signification by being in the world. Now, it's signification with several layers of quote marks, because it's obviously not meaning in the way we talk about it. But I think that he tried to create a continuity between ideas about natural life. I mean, life as natural, life as material, and mind, in a similar way to what you're describing there.
And I think ultimately it's also what led him to Buddhism.
Yes, but the final thing that I just want to say about that is what he's doing there is actually the same thing as what you talked about him doing in terms of making the brain the active generative part of things. It's not, it's perhaps a circular causality between the exterior and the interior, if you want to use those terms of definition. In relationality. So
and seeing the world as such a relational construct,
right,
where it becomes very difficult to distinguish between cause and effect. It becomes an integrated system that jointly develops new layers of reality. I think this is something that maybe related to Buddhist philosophy. I'm not an expert, but I could think that the way in which Francisco saw the brain and looking for a place in the brain of the self,
right,
which for a neurobiologist is extremely difficult because you see this as a distributed self-organizing system that where an emergent property is the agent who does something, who decides something. But as a neurobiologist, you would say, it's the brain that finds the optimal solution to a particular problem, and then there's an action, and somebody else sees this and that says this guy did this and that because of this and that. So the constraints on free will and autonomy, and the emergence of, or the attribution of an autonomous self, because I think, as Francisco would have thought, it is an attribution that you assign to yourself, and that is assigned to yourself by those who educate you. Otherwise, they wouldn't say, don't do this, or do this rather than, because there's an implicit assumption. If you can tell somebody this, it means you could have done otherwise, right? So it's behaviorist conditioning, but behind this is the idea that there's some independent self that you can shape, and then this will do what it should do.
The homunculus.
Yeah, and this is certainly not what Buddhist philosophy would assume.
No, I think Francisco saw in this what you described as being this functioning, brain functioning as being a dynamical distributed system, a great example of the non-localization of identity. An identity, in the way he described it, was an identity or self or an I or a consciousness emerges over time and in, in a certain configuration from a distributed system. So it can't be located in one part or in another part. And that corresponds very much, it might be a little simplified, we have some great Buddhist scholars here, but it corresponds very, very much to the notion of non-self or selflessness, or the insubstantiality of self as it's expressed.
And also the constructivistic view of perception, that there is nothing out there per se, but that you attribute the properties. That's at least what I think I learned in talking to Buddhist scholars. Mm-hmm. And then also the secular aspect of ethics. Mm-hmm. Francisco was certainly not an ontological dualist, and he was certainly not believing in ethics being derived from metaphysical forces that are imposed upon us, but he also saw them as an emergent property of cultural evolution, probably. Mm-hmm. And this is also something that distinguishes Buddhist philosophy from Christianity, for example, mm-hmm. where ethical settings are given, mm-hmm. And they are given by a transcendental force.
It's a prescriptive form.
Yeah, mm-hmm. But I think in Buddhist philosophy, it is more explained by a collective wisdom, by self-exploration, so by practices that do not require waiting for an inspiration coming from outside.
Mm-hmm. Right. And you yourself are very interested in this question of secular ethics. I know that's been a topic that's come up with you. At many a Mind and Life meeting.
I didn't know that I was a Buddhist. Somebody told me, or quite often it happened during lectures when I gave public lectures, and I explained to the people how we think that the brain works. And then I got interrupted more than one time by somebody in the audience who said, but you are a Buddhist. It was very strange to me. I had never thought about it. I had no idea what it was. And this may have triggered some interest in reading and studying a little bit more to find out why I was a Buddhist. And then I discovered, there are parallels in the way of thinking. Right. My way of thinking was shaped by neurobiological evidence.
But also by a European rounded education, right?
Yeah, I had a fairly secular education. Yeah, true.
A humanistic education.
Yeah, 9 years of Latin. It was tough. But you talked about secular ethics, yeah. And I think Francisco would have said something very similar. Mm-hmm. That we scientists, we have, of course, an obligation, and we also loaded some guilt on our shoulders. By doing what we do, we wiped the skies empty of gods. At least in many, many scientific theories, God is not present. And so since we all are bound to think along Occam's razor and not postulate stuff that for which there is no evidence, it's difficult to follow these very concrete constructions of there being entities that are responsible for our being and for our decisions. And so for the long path between the Ilias, where men still thought that all their actions were directed by some god or goddess up there, they could even talk to them and read their signs from bird fly and cloud drifts. we have destroyed all this. Mm-hmm. And so far we have failed dramatically to replace it by something. Mm-hmm. Maybe it starts now with the next generation that, based on, again, scientific evidence, that designs a very sober, if not to say dark future and dangers, we start to develop a different type of ethics that is evidence-based and tells us what we should do in order to avoid terrible things from happening. But I think we have to work on this very hard, because until insight becomes a dominant factor in controlling your behavior, this is a long way. Understanding something is by far not implying that you will do it. And maybe we need more psychology, different ways of education. I have no idea. I only know that Francisco was very much interested in aspects of secular ethics and the possibility of a secular ethics. You know him better. You should tell us.
You know, it's a complicated subject, and I think we can talk about it in the Q&A, but which is coming up. But I think that very much like you, because we know each other quite well. Francisco was really fascinated with mind. So obviously he was fascinated with brain as a neuroscientist, and the relation between brain, body, and exterior world or world environment. But it's hard to describe how fascinating it was for him, the depth, the pliability, the mobility, and the depth of his existential concerns. And his question was also, why is it that we're so, how do we develop these wide-ranging, from neurotic to poetic, existential concerns that are, take up every minute of our waking life? And that's one of the reasons why he was so fascinated by the research he did on the cushion, because for him it was research. It was research into mind. And so I think that for him, I think that if he were alive today, he would paint a dark picture, as you just did, and a picture of desperate need for something. But I think he said anyway, and he might still say something like, if you bring mind back into science, so yes, good evidence-based science, but if you bring mind into it, you're going to re-enchant something that cannot really be a complete picture, a full picture, without this first person aspect of mind.
And now I understand what you mean with mind. I was just wondering what you meant with mind, but yeah. This first person perspective, this is the point, I guess. Yes. And this is also the fascination that I took from my contacts with Buddhist teachers. The notion that you might be able to learn about the constitution of yourself and the world, not by doing the third person perspective business that we scientists do, by
very, very well
reaching out by experiments, but also by cultivating introspection, by learning to listen to processes in your brain. We say the brain is transparent to you. You don't feel it's working. It's trivial. It has no sensory sense, no sensors in the brain. When you have headache, it's the tissue around it, the dura. So the brain has no sensors. The brain, unlike the heart or so, you don't feel it. This is also the problem, that it does something for you that you have no recollection of. As an untrained brain possessor, strange word, but which also gives you a lot of space to interpret something into your brain, and which also, makes it possible to talk about free will and stuff like this, because you are not witnessing the processes in your brain that come up with these perceptions and these decisions. It's all transparent to us. If it were not, we would not have to do so much neuroscience, because we could just try to understand how it works by asking ourselves. But somehow this doesn't give you any answers. And as far as I understand, the practitioners, and I think Francisco at the end was a very committed practitioner. Mm-hmm. They claim you can, by really dissecting the micro processes in your brain that become visible once you get into particular states of meditation, that you learn something about the working of your brain, and you learn something about how your brain interprets the world. So a second source of knowledge. And what always fascinated me in these dialogues of mind and life was how much of the knowledge that you get through introspection from the first person perspective can be put in agreement with what we think we know from the third person perspective analysis. And I think this is still an important question. And we discovered that some things are congruent, others don't fit at all. Mm-hmm. And I think this epistemic adventure is not finished yet.
Yeah. Well, one of the most interesting aspects of it is also what can practitioners who are exploring the mind suggest to the third person scientists who are looking at brain correlates. And I know you've worked a little bit with Mathieu on that. You haven't been completely outside of those.
Yeah, I talked a lot with Mathieu about these problems. Certainly the phenomenologists who use also these techniques. I think Michel Dupont with microphenomenology actually operationalizes this approach. Teaches you something about, if you like, it's like a very sophisticated psychophysics. So the early psychologists in the 19th century, they started to explore how we perceive, how perception can be fooled, and how do the mechanisms. Now, they couldn't do much about the mechanisms, but the phenomenology of perceptual processes. Mm-hmm. I think they did experiments, but there's also this alternative way to try to understand what it does by paying attention to the inner working of your brain as much as it is accessible. I would assume that very experienced practitioners have much more access to what's going on in their under their skull than I have, but I don't know, because you can't really. It's hard to prove.
Thank you. Gabor, will you let me know when we should move to Q&A? Thank you so much, Wolf.
Probably this is just about the time when we can do that. It's so fascinating to hear your dialogue, though.
Thank you so much, Wolf. This was fast. It feels like we've just grazed the subjects, but maybe there'll be a next time.
Yeah, sure, there will be.
I would like to invite everyone participating in this meeting to consider questions. We have got one already in the chat. Before that, Wolf, if you may, I would just ask, do you see any specific concrete areas of work, terms or concepts where you identify Francisco as the main influence on your own research, on your own thinking?
Oh, yeah. I think it was this recomforting idea of what we now would call predictive coding, constructivistic perception. We were just so unison on these aspects, and You always have to be encouraged by somebody. If you are completely alone, it's hard to do it. So this is something I think I got from Francisco. And then again, we resonated a lot on the neurophysiological or neurobiological substrate of consciousness. This idea that it is a state that is characterized by a high degree of coherence. Must not be synchronous firing or something like this, but the coherence in the high dimensional space. The work he did when he was at the Salpêtrière. Mm-hmm. So I think this brought us together. And actually, my last encounter with Francisco, I think it's worth talking about this, was in Portugal. This was 2 years before he died, 1 year even. And it was a meeting on consciousness, strangely enough organized by an immunologist. I think his name was Coutinho.
Antonio Coutinho.
Mm-hmm. Antonio Coutinho, who was at the Institut Pasteur at the time. Mm-hmm. By the way, Francisco also having been interested very much in the immune system, because it's also a self-organizing, autonomous system that distinguishes between self and other. So and there, he was not alone. There was also the Nobel Prize winner Jerry Edelman, who saw very close connections between the organization of the brain and the organization of the immune system. Anyway, there was Francisco, and he had actually looked at pictures last night. My wife found them with Francisco still there, and he was discussing about the questions of consciousness. And this was in 2000. It was either 1999 or 2000.
It was after the transplant, yeah.
Yeah.
Thank you, Wolf. I may turn to the first question and would like to invite Ruben Flores. If you are here with us, Ruben, maybe you want to ask your question yourself?
Yes, Howard, thanks so much for this very interesting talk and conversation, really. Umberto Maturana was briefly mentioned, and I was just wondering whether Wolf could elaborate a bit more on the relationship between the work of Maturana and Francisco. Thanks.
I think it is obviously closely related, except that for me it was much more difficult to understand Umberto than Francisco. And I remember when I flew out of Santiago, the last few hours, I was sitting with Umberto, again in one of these airport restaurants, and he kept tracing on the paper cloth of the table. And he tried to explain to me this upside down view of the world, but in a much more radical way. And I left Chile not having understood Umberto very well. And then I tried to work my way through a book that he had written. I remember I had taken it on an island in the Bretagne and read through the bad weather times in this book. And I rarely had a book that was so difficult to understand. But I guess that Francisco was certainly impregnated and influenced by Umberto. They used similar words, and they knew Francisco was. What was the relation with respect to age?
There were 20 years, over 20 years difference between them. But he was the master. He was the first mentor who took over Francisco when he wanted to do basic research in biology and neurobiology instead of going to medical school, which was the only option at that time. So that allowed him to get his money to go to Harvard. And then Umberto was very close to Heinz von Förster as well. So during the years when Francisco was at Harvard, Umberto would come to Cambridge, would go to Cambridge to meet him, and would also go to Indiana to see von Förster, who they were working together. but I can't help you much on that subject either, Ruben, because I mean, we could talk sometime about where they diverted, which happened, just after they kind of, their paths split apart, which happened just after the Tree of Knowledge.
Yeah, I would think so. Because epistemically, they became very different after a while.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Thank you, Ruben. Kevin Martin has an interesting question also. Kevin, if you are here with us.
So hi, Wolf.
Yeah,
can you hear me?
Oh, nice. Yeah, I can hear you.
So I have to say, when I was very little, and I first came into the visual system, you were already one of the great gods of the visual system. And obviously, I had huge kind of respect and admiration, and it's great to see you still kind of burrowing into these kind of questions.
There must be a but now, Kevin.
No, there's no but. Just to say, it's just acknowledging, what you've done for the field, and we've pretty much, I think, on the same page in thinking about recurrence and resonance and all those kinds of things for a very long time. The question was, well, one was the point, just to say that, I mean, psychophysicists, of course, have been studying first-person experiences for 150 years, probably even before von Helmholtz. And so that has been a kind of implicit part of the whole scientific program. And I just wonder if you could kind of comment on that. And then just another question, you mentioned Mathieu. So he wrote a book called A Plea for Animals. And of course, you've also made pleas for animals, and have been a very kind of significant and important apologist for work experiments on animals, because most of what we know about brain structure and function has really come from animals, and your work in particular has been very crucial. And the fact that you've been a kind of ambassador for particularly non-human primate research has been very important in Europe, I think. And I wonder if you could just comment on that.
Yeah. You're absolutely right. All the psychophysics in the 19th century, which was grandiose, Mach and Helmholtz and all those giants, they investigated processes from the first person perspective. Yeah. I think what they mean when they talk about the mind is something that is not directly related to what the psychophysicists did, who studied perception essentially, let's call it self-perception. So the diving into your own constitution. I had a lot of discussion and also dissent with Mathieu Ricard on that, because I said, well, we have a technique in the Occident that is called psychoanalysis, and there's a guy like Freud, who actually also tried to find something out about the mind. And this is very different, because you always need a person of reference, and you need a dialogue, and you need to verbalize stuff. While when you meditate, you're alone with yourself, and who tells you to which extent what you discover is relevant. It's not an illusion. I have no solution to that problem. I would prefer to make an experiment if possible. And then the other dispute, of course, is animal experimentation. It's an extremely complex ethical problem, because you have to weigh against each other incommensurate variables. What does it mean sacrificing the life of an organism for the sake of knowledge acquisition? This is something that every society has to decide on the basis of their consensus. And when one can go either way. If you take the Shains in India, who wouldn't even kill a mosquito, and the meat-consuming Western societies. Well, it's probably not the place to discuss this issue, which is certainly an extremely important issue. How are we related to our nearest neighbors? And I think what neuroscience told us actually is that these animals, all the animals, all the way down the phylogenetic tree, have much more what we call consciousness, ability to predict, ability to suffer, than we had ever thought, because we now know how similar our brains are. So I think if a science has told us to be cautious, then it is neuroscience.
Thanks very much, both.
Thank you for the question, Kevin, for both questions. Wolfgang Lucas would like to come back to one of your points that you mentioned, Wolf. So I would invite Wolfgang, if you are here with us, to ask your question.
Yes, thank you. I wanted to ask you about your relationship or collaboration with Francisco, as you mentioned that you had very fruitful conversations and discussions and collaborations with Francisco, even though you sometimes disagreed, or maybe even because you sometimes disagreed on perhaps even fundamental questions or views. And so I wanted to ask you if you could describe some specific qualities or values that you found in Francisco, or even between both of you, that made it possible to actually collaborate well, despite or because of disagreements or divergences.
Yeah, I think the scientific disagreements or the epistemic disagreements were absolutely no barrier for our friendship and collaboration. I experienced Francisco as an extremely gentle person. I can't imagine Francisco being I lack the English words for this, but being brutal or getting too loud, for example. I couldn't imagine. He was extremely gentle, but uncompromisable when it came to either scientific talks or philosophical discussions. There he was very strict and insisted on logics and proper argumentation. There he could be very serious, but in social interactions he was extremely pleasant, and so were his co-workers. He somehow always had selected nice people. Very gentle personality.
And if I may, to follow up on that, do you think he attracted people who had these kinds of qualities, or might have been perhaps some inspiration to develop this?
Well, when he was in Paris on his own, building his lab, he just created a very friendly environment. At least this was the experience I had when I visited them. And I didn't see him in Jussieu yet, but afterwards at Salpêtrière, I visited very often. And it was very gentle when these guys were sitting in their bunker under the ground, doing their experiments. Was always a very inspiring intellectual atmosphere around Francisco. He was, he just created this environment.
Thank you, Wolfgang.
Thank you. Yeah, thanks.
We have just received a very interesting question from Tommaso Tosato. Tommaso, you are here with us, and I think you can raise your question yourself.
Yeah, thank you. So, hi, Wolf.
You are in the lab. That's good.
I'm in one of the institutes that Wolf was founding, so I'm a very lucky person in Frankfurt. So, Wolf, actually I have two questions. The first one is, if Varela would have still been alive in the last 20 years, which one of the findings that changed our field would have inspired him the most, and how his theories could have changed given the new things we know in the last 20 years? So wait, this is the first one. And the second one is, I was part of Mind and Life in the last year, and we often, sometimes we discuss on how contemplative practice can influence the way we are present in academia and the way we make science. So how do you think Varela was influenced by his contemplative practice in his way to be present inside an institution, and in his way to be present when thinking of a new hypothesis in science?
Well, last question first. I had less intense contact with Francisco at the time when he got very close to Buddhism, Mind and Life, and in his dialogues with His Holiness the Dalai Lama. That happened after the time in Frankfurt. I think it just started that he became interested in Buddhism when he left Frankfurt. And then I didn't follow very closely his further development in Paris, except at the scientific level. And I was surprised when I discovered that he was now very much engaged in Mind and Life, and he started these epistemic dialogues. And unfortunately, I had not been witnessing these interactions because I only got involved with Mind and Life after Francisco had passed away. So I can't really say what the cause is and what the effect is. I think from what I know, he was just a gentle person and built an environment around himself that was livable and kept work ethics high. What would he been? Would have he been very happy had he still been able to follow the science over the next years? I think he would have continued to influence how things are going. So I think his work on consciousness was just about to bear fruits, and this should have continued. And he would have continued along those lines, I guess. He might even have created a new way of neuroscience by integrating more first-person perspective and third-person perspective, or in action. I don't know. But what he would certainly be very happy about is that we are now, I think, no longer discussing very much as to whether the brain is a constructivistic organ, whether perception is a Bayesian process and dominated by predictive coding and using internal models of the world in order to describe the world. He would have liked this. Then he would have liked very much that we don't distinguish anymore very much between sensory processes and executive processes, but see the whole thing as a very integrated system where you can't really talk about a linear stream of signals from input stages, sensory input stages, all the way out to the motor part, but we see it as a distributed, still central system, but that is so heavily interconnected that there be no sensory processing without at the same time going on with some executive processing and vice versa. So he would have liked that, I think. I think he would have been quite happy with the development of modern neuroscience. He would have been a bit disappointed, I guess, because what we experienced over the past decade, and I think my colleagues would consent to this, is enough to cite just the conclusion of a recent Ernst Stringman forum that we had on the cerebral cortex, where somebody summarized the week of discussion that we have accumulated a fantastic amount of new evidence because of these new methods that we have now in our hands, from the large scale to the microscopic scale, enormous amount of data. But what we really lack is breakthroughs in concepts that would help us forward. And this is also what Francisco would have probably said, because he was very concept driven.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you, Tommaso, for the question. You mentioned Mind and Life, Wolf, that Francisco was involved in Mind and Life, was one of the co-founders in 1987, and that you joined Mind and Life after he had passed away. How would you describe your own experience with Mind and Life? What influence it had on your thinking, and where do you see the importance of the work that we are doing here in Europe, especially because we are now living in this European context?
Well, I have seen the development for quite some time, and I also see changes, and also necessary changes. When I joined Mind and Life, this was, I think, after we had a commemorative conference on Francisco in Paris. And this is where I met Adam Engel, who was the orchestrator of these Mind and Life encounters. It's also where I met Mathieu for the first time. And I was fascinated by the epistemic adventure of this enterprise, bringing together hard-nosed Western analytical third-person scientists with contemplatives, and trying to see to which extent we can learn from each other. And this was also the overarching theme in all those meetings. And then it got taken over by a different public. It was a small group discussing and writing, publishing books. And then there became these big movements. I guess it coincided with America discovering Buddhism as an alternative to whatever they were unhappy about. Because I remember these big meetings where His Holiness was giving talks, and there were 10,000 or 15,000 people in the hall, and there was a discussion on the podium on the results of these epistemic discussions that had been prepared in much smaller groups. And at that time, it became, it changed path. It became, at least in certain environments, a hype. It also coincided, I don't know whether this was causal, with the mindfulness movement. There was an initial very, very important idea that many of the problems that we face in interpersonal interactions could be alleviated if we would have a more mindful behavior, and that meditation or self-concentration and these practices would help you to become more mindful. I think this was the idea behind it. Also that John Kabat-Zinn followed. And then it got more and more taken over by commercially interested institutions. This is why after a while people had this bad word for it, we're calling it mindfulness, where everybody was talking about it and everybody thought. I remember encounters in Washington after one of these big conferences where people recognized me on the street because I had been on the podium before, saying that I'm a Buddhist too, assuming that I would say, that is wonderful, then you are a good man or woman. So there was this strange identification of being good and being a Buddhist. I think this has never really touched Europe, fortunately, but was one of the reasons why Mind and Life Europe was founded, because we felt that in Europe, we needed something else. We needed something more epistemically oriented, more scientifically based, and keep alive this dialogue between the different sources of knowledge. So at that time, the decision was reached in Denver. It was also a wish of His Holiness that Europe should articulate itself and do it in a different way, because obviously Europe is different, even though it has been disqualified as the old continent. But I think it has some traditions that are worth preserving. And I think the Mind and Life dialogue that is also supported by Mind and Life Europe is of a different quality and need not be centered in that sense. It is also more tolerant, need not be centered on Buddhism only. There are other spiritual traditions that have originated in Europe that are in many respects similar and that can be cultivated and that they need to be integrated into our scientific endeavors. So let me say a credo. I think ultimately, if we don't bring together the humanities and the natural sciences, we won't make it. And we already see that we stall in neurobiology when we want to explain consciousness by just considering the brain from a third-person perspective. Does it work? We don't get the grips with the hard problem of consciousness. And similarly, I think concentrating on third-person perspective science alone will not make it. And Mind and Life Europe is one place where attempts are made seriously to bring together wisdom that is not coming from third-person perspective, analytical science. And there are several sources. Contemplation is one. There must be more. And bring these together with what scientific practices are. So I'm happy that Mind and Life Europe is existing and is going his own way now, and is obviously growing, getting.
Thank you, Wolf. I think probably the final question, but we may look around in the room and see if there are more questions. Would be a little bit of a summary how you see the future. You mentioned several topics in your sharing that interests you these days. You mentioned secular ethics, you mentioned animal rights, and now you mentioned the need to bring together natural and social sciences. Considering the next generation of scientists, researchers, philosophers, contemplative practitioners in this tradition of Francisco Varela and Mind and Life Europe, what do you see or do you think the main themes should be for us to continue exploring in these dialogues, especially among the next generation of scholars?
I think if you just start whatever talk you give, whether it's basic science or a philosophical talk, show the picture that we now have from the Earth, from the space perspective. This little blue ball in the middle of nowhere, millions of light years away from putative other planets where perhaps something may have emerged that is also alive and self-generating and interpreting the world and is conscious. Seeing this, I think that should be enough to convince us that we really have to make a big effort all together to preserve this little island. And if we do what we can along those lines, that will give us back dignity. And this sort of dignity is required, whatever you do.
Thank you, Wolf. It's really touching to experience your gentle sensitivity when you talk about the animals, when you talk about the planet, when you talk about Francisco. And you use this term, gentle and kind, a lot when you were describing Francisco. And it's a real privilege for us to have you with us, that you spent your last few decades in your professional career here with Mind and Life Europe in the same gentle, kind manner, and that you could be not only a friend to Francisco, but a friend to his legacy and a friend to Amy. And thank you, Amy, for the wonderful conversation that you initiated with Wolf. Maybe you want to add some final words and thank Wolf for his talk.
Not always gentle, Gabor.
Well, there's also tough love. Sometimes people need tough love. Well, yeah, I love this last image that you gave us of looking at a little ball, and that the idea that we regain our dignity by coming to understand how puny our egos are and how petty our egos are. And that's the way of regaining your identity, and not by bloating your ego. And I think that, that's a quality that I agree completely with Gabor evoked, which is this, I would say, the gentleness and the egolessness of the true researcher, which you, I think, have beautifully communicated to us tonight. And joyfully, because you clearly have a lot of joy in your history and in your adventures, your scientific and human adventures. And so I really want to thank you for sharing with us. And I hope we can do it again, because I really want to hear how you're progressing on the clarinet.
Yeah, we will certainly continue to talk. And let me assure you, there are ups and downs. It's not always gentle. It's not always hilarious. But that's how life is, huh?
Yeah, it is.
It was a great pleasure to talk to you. And hopefully meet in person at some stage. I mean, it gets a bit too long now.
Yes, we would need to. Thank you so much. I would like to thank you, Amy, for the wonderful facilitation, and Geneviève for the French translation that you provided us. Thank you so much.
Geneviève, thank you.
Thank you, Geneviève.
Translating must have been terrible.
The team, Johanna, who's here.
Yes.
Our new friend and new MLE team member.
Yes, Johanna, who helped with the slides and also with the live streaming. Thank you, Johanna. And I would like to thank you all who participated in today's meeting. And the only information I would like to share at the end of the meeting, and I may ask Johanna to put up the later slide, is that we have one more Francisco and Friends webinar this year before concluding the year on December 9th with Valerie Bonardel, who also worked with Francisco and
she worked with Francisco during the Jussieu period, during the pigeon period, and did all sorts of interesting color vision work with him.
And actually, Valerie is here with us in the room tonight, and she is going to speak on December 9th on why is color still a good case study of embodied cognition and an action. So we are looking forward to hearing your sharing, Valerie, and thank you so much for joining us and listening to Amy and Wolf. And thank you all once again.
Thank you, Gabor, for this introduction, and thank you again for this lovely conversation tonight and for organizing this series, which is very rich for all of us. Thank you.
Thank you, Valerie.
And talk to you soon.
Yeah.